almost all art pop in the modern era in some ways refers back to Tears for Fears. Well, all of their records really, but particularly this record because it was so massive.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me that if you look at the artists that weren't at Live Aid, they're the ones we're enthusing about the most.
Yeah.
I don't know if you noticed that. So Kate Bush wasn't at Live Aid. Tears for Fears were not at Live Aid. Van Morrison was not at Live Aid. And I'm not even sure. Actually, I think Simple Minds were at Live Aid, weren't they? Maybe,
were they?
I don't know. Maybe they weren't.
U2 definitely were.
U2 were, yes.
I mean, Robert Plant was obviously with Led Zeppelin.
But there's an album that we don't rate. So the albums that and I'm not suggesting there's any connection between these two things at all, by the way. But I'm just saying that interesting side note that a lot of these artists that made these incredible records, I think have stood the test of time, were not part of that kind of Live Aid bubble. Tears for Fears, Songs from a Big Chair. This is one of those albums where almost every song on it was like a massive hit single, to the point that probably there was a struggle to follow it up. And I know there was a struggle. They took 3 years, which at the time was almost unheard of to make a follow-up. You talk about Sensual World. I mean, that was 4 years after Hounds of Love, wasn't it? Tears for Fears similarly spent 3 to 4 years trying to fashion a follow-up.
Didn't they both come out 89? Or was
They did, yeah.
Sensual World, Caesar Love.
They did, yes, yeah. So they both spent 4 years trying to follow up these career-defining records and zeitgeist-defining records. Here's a band that are in another universe could have easily been an experimental progressive rock group.
Yeah.
And yet they're coming up in the era of post-punk, they're coming up in the era of new romantic music, they're coming up in the era of electronic pop music. And their first album, The Hurting, is very much an electronic pop record. This has got a bit of everything going on with it. It's got aspirations to fill stadiums. It's got a love of technology. It's also got a love of just writing beautifully crafted pop songs. Everybody Wants to Rule the World, of course, is such a irresistible, classic, timeless piece of pop. But then so is Shout, but in a completely different way. It's almost like, can this be the same band? You know, I remember hearing Shout and having a similar kind of epiphany as I did with Running Up the Hill. Firstly, it's 6 minutes. It wasn't edited for the single. It was allowed to run I think it's more than 6 minutes. It's got an almost semi-industrial approach
rhythmically
to the drum pattern, and yet at the same time it's rock music.
Well, for me, Shout, the immediate precedent, weirdly, is a very short track. I mean, again, I think this is an incredibly innovative piece of pop music, economical production, economical lyrically, and yet staggeringly original and important. We Will Rock You, in some ways. I think Shout reminds me of that.
Okay, interesting.
In that it's this kind of pummeling rhythm, and in effect, one very simple hook line that grips you very, very quickly.
But I mean, compared to We Will Rock You, it's a very
We Will Rock You with 2 minutes.
And also it's a very economically. This is a very produced, very low. There's a lot of overdubbing in this. I know because I've remixed it. There's a lot of layers in this music, but a lot of them are what you might call sound design moments, as opposed to a rhythm guitar part that's going through the whole track, or a keyboard pad that's going through the whole track. There are things that pop up in the arrangement that kind of keep you interested, which was a very Trevor Horn thing.
Yeah.
And I think there's a sense that a lot of music made in the mid to late 80s was informed by this kind of template that Trevor Horn had laid down for making sophisticated pop records, which were as much about these little sound design moments that kind of keep your attention.
Yeah.
So just when you feel like the song might be beginning to become a little bit repetitive, I'll get that. I know what they're doing now. Something else comes in, an element comes in the arrangement that's fresh, that's new. And Tears for Fears are all about that. They're full of this. And a lot of their tracks, 6, 7, obviously by the time we get to the following album, Seeds of Love, 8 minutes long. And there's a lot of stuff always being introduced into the arrangement to keep your attention, which is a very prog rock thing to do.
But I think they brought in a prog rock sensibility to pop, this
Yes.
art pop
Well-
in effect. And obviously Chris Hughes, who co-produced the album,
Yeah.
is a huge fan of progressive music.
Well,
I know
them
he'd come
and-
out of Adam and the Ants.
Yeah,
but
well, them and Kate Bush, which is which is why I think of these two records very much as they are artists that kind of brought this progressive or conceptual rock sensibility into pop.
But what they did that works is, for me, they come from that background of progressive music, but they're determined to make progressive music in the here and now.
Yeah.
They're not determined to recreate. In some ways, what they're doing is they're echoing the innovations of the past, but entirely in a contemporary language. And what's kind of peculiar about both those albums is that at the time they were massive, and at the time they had very general appeal. But there wasn't particularly a great deal that came out after them that mimicked them. I mean, maybe in a way they were quite difficult. They were quite complex
I
records.
think that's it. I think I remember having a chat with Gary Kemp, and Gary said, I was talking about Tears for Fears because I think he'd interviewed them with Guy on the Rock on Tour show. And I said, I heard your interview with Roland, and I think he's interviewed Kurt as well on the show. And he said to me, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but he said something to me, when Tears for Fears were around in the mid-'80s, all of us, and I think he was referring to like Hit Them and Duran Duran, we all knew they were way ahead of us. And I think I understand that. It doesn't mean they made better music or better records, but I think in terms of their sophistication and their approach to music, they were on another level, as was Kate, Kate. But obviously they're from that same generation. Kate obviously came from the previous generation. They came from the same generation as Duran Duran, as Spandau Ballet, as Orchestral Moves in the Dark, as Ultravox. And yet all those bands secretly were looking at them and saying, oh my God.
So I remember when, No Man played the Hemel Hempstead Battle of the Bands in 1989, that fateful gig which we won. But what was interesting is, even though it was the tail end of the decade, quite a number of the bands were still under the spell of U2 Simple Minds.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder if it is because it was easy for 4Kids to do, to approximate that sound, whereas to make Hounds of Love 2 or Songs from the Big Chair 2 was out of people's budget, but also out of their imagination and skill set.
Well, they're very studio-led records. They're very production-orientated records. So, I mean, there wouldn't be much fun for kids getting into a rehearsal studio and trying to sound like running up that hill. Oh, the drummer, you just go dum 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 dum. Obviously getting together and forming a band, it's all about making a big rock sound, isn't it? So, yes, you're right. I think it was a very studio-bound sound. And it was ironically these days those kind of sounds are easily within the reach of anyone with a laptop, and Logic and GarageBand on their laptop. But those days it meant going to a big studio with a Fairlight computer, which famously cost the same price as a house at the time.
Yes, but I think as well, going back to what Gary Kemp said, I think probably the music that Kate Bush and Tears for Fears were making was the music that they really wanted to make, because it was a distillation of influences, combining with the technology of the day, and you listen to Songs from the Big Chair, it takes the odd risk, I Believe, which is the tribute to Robert Wyatt. Hardly, the name really on the lips of most pop pickers of 1985. They were not shying away from what they loved.
I think the B-side of that is their version of Seesaw.
It is, because I think Robert Wyatt said that he was really grateful that they'd name-checked him, but it would be better if they covered him so he'd get some money.
Get some royalties, yeah. No, it's a fantastic record. And of course, lest we forget, it ends with this 7-minute almost instrumental tone poem called Listen, which is, again, a fantastic studio concoction, playing with the possibilities of the studio. And I think that's what we love about this era, isn't it?